I've started the recording, so we're underway. And what I'll say to start with is, since we know who you are, John and Martin, and the students had links to your bio information in our classroom, I'm not going to introduce you. But if the students jump in with questions, I'm going to ask them to please introduce themselves briefly. Your name, your major, what year you're in, that sort of thing. We're here with John Huey and Martin Nisenholtz to talk about the Riptide report, which I had read not quite a year ago, not long after it came out, I guess. And when I was invited to do this class, I immediately thought of this report as something that would be a good one to use in the class. Just a housekeeping thing, we will keep this to an hour. We'll be done at 2 o'clock St. Louis time. Just a reminder to my students, if you find it disquieting, the way Google jumps back and forth depending on who's talking, you can just click on the face of the person who is talking, and that'll bring that person to the main screen, and it'll keep them there, so interruptions won't mess anything up. So just to dive in, I thought I'd ask you both. One of the things we've been discussing is this notion of original sin in the newspaper industry, and I wondered if you all used that title in one of your chapters ironically, or if you really do believe there was an original sin as part of this whole evolution.
Well, I'll start it, but now is this working? Because my thing says the microphone is muted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I think that when we began it, we kind of wondered if there had been an original sin. And, in fact, we wondered if Martin wasn't one of the original sinners.
Huh? The original sinner.
The original, or certainly the most impactful sinner. But, you know, we wanted to get to the bottom of that and sort of look at it from the point of view of, well, what led to that decision, those decisions that had been. I think that a better way to put it is that a lot of people in the media, in the journalism business, particularly on the editorial side, were operating, and many still are, with the idea that somehow that was Pandora's box that was opened, and you know it never would. All this wouldn't have happened if the people in charge hadn't decided to give away content on the web. But we quickly got that out of the way in our reporting, because we discovered all kinds, and we were reminded of all kinds of things, like the fact that CNN had nothing to lose by giving it away, that Reuters had nothing to lose in the American market by giving it away, and the fact that they chose Yahoo. In other words, the New York Times, which is where Martin was making the decisions, they didn't have any choice at the time. And so we got over the idea of the original sinner, although we like to hold it over Martin's head. So yes, we did mean it ironically by the time we had reached publication. Martin, you want to confess?
Yeah, no, I think that was a good summary. Just as taking us back to the decision, you know, to me it was at that time a complete no-brainer. I think the context is really important. That today we take for granted things like broadband connectivity, you know, highly resolute screens. In many cases, you know, mobile and portable computing that just didn't exist back in 1995. And so the first thing that everyone needs to understand is that the product attributes in 1995, 1996 were just not worth paying for, in my view. Secondly, the thing that was so interesting about the web, and we point this out if you go through some of the Yahoo interviews, is that it didn't really particularly like a 24-hour news cycle. In other words, had nothing to do with the 24-hour news cycle. That was a function of printing and the printing press and the distribution technology of surrounding printing. The web really is about continuous news, breaking news, and Reuters had licensed its wire to Yahoo well before the Times started its website. And Yahoo News very quickly became the largest news site on the web because it was fast, free, and instantly updated. And so it was actually a much superior news experience for a very long time to anything that the newspapers were doing. And so if you had charged for the New York Times website in 1995, 1996, nobody would have paid for it because it wasn't very good, to be blunt. So the third thing is that we felt at the time, and I still feel, that in order to create a media business, you need to have an audience. I mean, we weren't a newsletter company. We weren't prepared to create a business with 10,000 subscribers to the New York Times paying $300 a year. We needed to create a big advertising business, and for that to happen, we needed to have a big audience. And so, like most others at the time, we decided that would be, the only way to get there would be to go free for, at least for the first phase of the website's development. So it was those three factors that that led us to that decision. And if you read Arthur Sulzberger's interview, if you read some of the Yahoo stuff, there's very little question that that we made the right decision. There was no sin. It's an absurdity.
So the devil's advocate question, which we did explore in the report, is if you're the devil's advocate at the time, you say, well, the Wall Street Journal, the other big national daily, never gave it away and decided to charge, and they sort of ended up in a place where they're able to charge. And we asked that question to people from Dow Jones, and Martin has a strong and very understandable explanation of the difference there. So would you add that on as a shirt tail?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's important to understand that the Journal still doesn't have, to my knowledge, the digital revenues that the New York Times does. For years and years, it was highly, highly constrained by not having enough advertising inventory to satisfy demand, which is exactly what we feared would happen if we charged, and actually had to go out and pay $600 million for MarketWatch in order to supplement its inventory to grow its business at a certain point in time. I think what was happening at the Journal, John, very simply, is that they were scared to death of cannibalization of their print edition.
Plus there's another point, Martin, that is very important, and I worked at the Journal for 13 years. They began life as a data company, and they, for many years, they sold their electronic data before the newspaper really mattered much. So they had a non-advertising, subscription-based electronic data business, and they didn't want to. The idea of giving anything away was anathema to them because of that in their culture. So
totally agree. Totally agree.
Right. So what we're talking about is the difference between, on the one hand, the New York Times wanted to build scale and build an audience that they could sell advertising to, which they wouldn't be able to do, or at least in their judgment at that time, your judgment, Martin, they could not have built the audience to the scale that they needed to sell advertising if they had imposed a toll road on the access. Whereas with the Wall Street Journal, they already had a culture of selling content and selling it on a fee at a fee schedule, and so that was something that kind of continued in the mentality at that point. Is that a good summary?
Yes, except that the Journal's strategy allowed another company, CBS MarketWatch, to come in and basically redefine business news on the web and, be the large player in that marketplace, costing them $600 million in 2005. I'm just pointing out the fact that that happened. I mean, it's.
Well, also, another way of looking at it, Martin, I mean, the New York Times won in that from an internal point of view, and that the New York Times is still the same corporate entity that it was when all this began. It's still owned by the Sulzbergers. They made all the calls. It's still the same culture, the same company. Dow Jones, in essence, the model that they were running and the people who were running it, in essence, they failed because their business was in steep decline, headed nowhere good when Rupert Murdoch bailed them out for a premium. Now, the people and the shareholders got rich because Rupert Murdoch paid way more than it was worth. But at that point, the business model of the Journal and Dow Jones changed radically because it was part of News Corp. So the old Dow Jones, we do it our way, go it alone, they failed. That business lost. All those people are gone.
So let me step back for a second and just ask you a broader question. What is it that compelled you both in the first place to do this report?
Why don't I start? Well, it wasn't. First of all, there are three of us. Paul Sagan isn't on the call. He was the vital and important colleague and third partner. And it was somewhat serendipitous. We all basically landed at Harvard at the same time, all faced with having to do a project. At the time, no one had ever done anything like this before. Everybody before us had written, white papers of varying lengths, from 15 to 150 pages. And we were all interested roughly in the same topic, although probably from different angles. And so, interestingly, about a month before the fellowship started, I got a call from a guy named John Geddes, who is today a fellow at Harvard working on Riptide. And we can get into what he's doing in a minute, but he was at the time number 2 or 3 guy in the New York Times newsroom and a close colleague of mine and a friend. And he called me and he said, look, there's a guy named John Huey who's going to be landing at Harvard. You ought to just try and hook up with him. He's a very interesting guy, and I think he wants to do something roughly in the same area as you do. And then I don't recall exactly how Sagan came into it, but I think he came in through John. And so the three of us got on the phone one day and decided it made a lot of sense to work together. And we also decided in that same phone call that we had no interest in writing a white paper, that we wanted to actually create something that was alive and that would be, organic and able to be grown over a very long period of time. And so our time there was really just spent laying the foundation for this. I've always seen this as as something that can grow and build over time, and that's exactly what's happening now that John Geddes is there working on it this semester.
I think that I had come very fresh from the battlefield, and like the month before I got there, I had been the editor-in-chief of Time Inc. and had been that for 7 years, and before that, for years, the editorial director, and I was really off the battlefield and dazed and confused about what had happened to me and the business and everything else. And I had some strong opinions that I had held. The fog of war, you got to get up every day and you got to go out there and try to kill the enemy, and I did my best, but when I got out of it, I was like, "Oh, this isn't headed to a good place," and sort of really wondered what happened. And when we got up there, we Googled the topic, and we found, I think was it 52,000 or 72,000 articles or white papers or things. It was some tens of thousands of people had written big exegeses on this subject, and it just seemed like we didn't need to go down the road that Clay Shirky had gone down, that the Columbia had gone, there were all these papers. And then we started talking, and I think this is a very important point for somebody who sets out to do something like this. We didn't agree on a lot of things in the beginning. I mean, there were all kinds of premises that each of us had that the other one was skeptical of. And then we just decided, okay, well, we're not going to sit around and argue about this with ourselves. We're going to go talk to all the people who we're going to identify. We're going to identify the people who we think were the key players, and we'll go ask them these questions, and then we'll just we'll let them tell the story. And of course, we have a lot of interstitial material that sort of puts it in context. But the great thing about this project, from our point of view, and why it ended up being a really wonderful. Every now and then you work on something that's just doesn't feel like work, and the reason for it in this case was the spirit of collaboration that quickly developed, and discovery. We were like, wow, I wonder what Arianna Huffington is going to say. Or, although we didn't really wonder what she was going to say. That's a bad example. But she was going to talk about Arianna Huffington and her own brilliance. But there are others, including Arthur. And we even went, to see, this is a story of schoolboys, of aging men acting like schoolboys. We got on the train one day and took two or three stops down to MIT to go in to meet Tim Berners-Lee, and when you get there, there's a sign that says World Wide Web over his office, and you go, wow, here we are, we found the World Wide Web, and in fact it is, because it's Tim Berners-Lee who invented the World Wide Web. And we were all gaga, and at the end of the session, one of us, and I'm not going to name any names, had to have a picture taken with him, a very non-journalistic, because we were so in awe of being there in the office of the World Wide Web. But we had a lot of moments like that were, and then some of the things that people told us, we really, Martin and I were out in Northern California talking to Mike Moritz, who was a former Time magazine reporter who had become a venture capitalist, and he was one of the early backers of both Yahoo and Google, and he's now Sir Mike Moritz, and he has a lot of money, and he also has a lot of sort of received wisdom, and we started asking about the original sin in Yahoo and news and what it did to news, and he said, he looked at us and he said, we never thought about the news. It was just really a little afterthought that we threw in there. Did anybody think that we were thinking news was? Anyway, there were a lot of aha moments like that we shared, and then as Martin said, the real idea behind it was, instead of writing and people approached us afterwards about this, did we want to make it into a book? And I really didn't want to make it into a book, because I thought this subject doesn't lend itself to static plugging it one place at a time. I think a book gives it a false ending, because it isn't over. And I'm really hoping that people will we have one, John Geddes is working on it now. I hope that we'll have other people. I hope maybe one of these people who showed up for the Hangout someday will be there doing it. Or more likely that somebody in the Hangout someday will decide, okay, enough time has passed to where you could write a really good history of all this, and this Riptide, which is open to the public, it would be a useful source for a historian trying to figure out what happened in this period. And that just felt a lot better than to me. If I had written a white paper, one of the first people, and one of the people I would have had to pick their brain the most was Martin. And I remember saying to Martin, it just doesn't make any sense for you to be next door in an office and I'm coming to interview you for my white paper. And why would you tell me anything anyway, because you're going to be writing your white paper. And as a matter of fact, there was a guy at the Harvard Business School who, while all this was going on, was writing a case study using Martin as the case study. So Martin was sort of the white-hot he was the white hot heat of the thing, and
Sure.
Paul and I brought our own skills and enthusiasm to the project. But a lot of the intellectual capital is in Martin's head, who's now joining your profession at Boston University.
Well, it's a really impressive feat. I mean, getting 60 of some of the most powerful people in the media industry to sit down for the amount of time that you got them, and to be as candid as they were about what they think went well and what they think went wrong is really amazing to me. I'll say I had read this after it came out, and then I reread it again this July while I was sitting on the beach with warm weather and cool breezes and feeling good about the world, except for as I was reading this, I had this feeling that there was this sense of inevitability about where everything was going to go between the free content online, between the pressure that public newspaper companies were feeling to show growth, between the consolidation in the retail industry, with the slow pace, well, not slow pace, but the pace of technological innovation, with the newspaper industry's inability to recruit and retain really strong developers. It just felt like there was just this sense of there was no way that this couldn't have happened, and I wondered if that's kind of how you felt as you were working through this.
Yeah, I totally felt that way. I'm really glad that you came to that conclusion, because I think that's if someone asked me what was the most surprising and in some ways the most interesting outcome for me, that's it. I mean, there's this cliche that goes around that says that newspapers are dumb and slow and bureaucratic, and there's some truth to some of that. But one of the most interesting interviews that I always like to point people to is the one of Tony Ritter. And in fact, there are 2 or 3 people from Knight Ritter that are worth listening to. Kathy Yates, who ran their digital department, and there's another fellow who ran their R&D lab. I mean, they were invested in a big way in every interactive technology since the invention of new media in 1982, 83, 81, something in that range. And they just kept going at it and at it and at it. They were the first customer of Netscape. They were the first people. To create their own separate digital division of any company, and yet they failed. And I think the reason is in the metaphor that John came up with, this Riptide metaphor, which is that the thing about a riptide is that it's very hard to extract yourself from it. It's not something that, and in some ways, the faster you swim, and the more vigorously you swim, the more you get sort of tired out and just drown. And I think in Knight Ritter's case, that's exactly what happened. And so it wasn't that they were stupid or slow or uninvested or unable to grasp the implications or anything like that. It was just simply that the whole analog dollars to digital pennies thing happened so fast to the classified markets that their whole business model fell apart pretty much instantaneously. And there wasn't much they could do. I mean, they had a major investment in Career Builder, which was a huge success on the Help Wanted side, and even that couldn't save them. So I think you're right on with that, and there's plenty of evidence throughout all of the interviews, and in fact the essay as well, that that's the case.
And there was the title Riptide does certainly imply that inevitability. A riptide creates confusion, and the harder you work, the quicker you fail. But there was another concept that we kept hitting on over and over and over, and it wasn't just because we were right across the street from the Harvard Business School, but it was the Clay Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma, which most of you are journalism students and not graduate business students, but if you were a graduate business student, you'd be intimately familiar with the Innovator's Dilemma, which basically is you're running a big business and you have big sources of revenue that you depend on for your profit and your growth, and an disruptive and innovative force comes along, be it technology or whatever, and when you react to it, you're naturally just human nature is you're forced to, and not just human nature, but stock price pressure and other things. You can't cannibalize your business as fast as an innovator who has nothing to lose. And so Craig of Craigslist has nothing to lose in his business model of giving everything away, and then he can charge for real estate or whatever. Whereas a newspaper, that's their highest profit business, and they can't just make a decision overnight that says their highest margin business. They can't decide, okay, well, we'll give everything away since Craig is giving it away. They are hamstrung from making that decision, and there are various ways they can react, and you could argue that there are things some of them could do, but again, to Martin's point, you can go to companies that did do it. The Tribune created, huge profitable sites to sell cars, and what were the names of those, Martin? I forget.
Cars.com.
Yeah. And they did all that, and that worked, but it didn't stop the erosion of their core business. So, yeah, the inevitability, actually, if you were sitting on the beach reading it, I feel a little sorry for you, but I can see how that could really bum you out. But from my point of view, it was the dead of winter in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was a very long winter. And by the end of the winter, I was really cheered up by the fact that it was inevitable. I felt somehow expiated, like, oh, well, maybe that decision I made in February of 2003 didn't really have much to do with this. I don't think I need a lot of guilt. It was going to happen.
To John's point, we were criticized for that. I mean, some people interpreted that finding as, oh, you guys, particularly John and me, because Paul worked in a different business for most of that period of time, but particularly John and me, you're just making an excuse. You could have done all this stuff, and you ended up where you ended up. And I mean, we certainly had absolutely. I just speaking for myself. I don't want to speak for John, but I had absolutely nothing in mind about that at all. I mean, it never even occurred to me to think that way, much less to kind of in a Machiavellian way find that finding. And I would have been just as happy to see it go the other way. I mean, the Times, which is where I spent most of my career during this period of time. My whole career during this period of time, is doing reasonably well at this point. So maybe the inevitability doesn't quite apply to them as much as local newspapers, which is, by the way, another finding that came up through Julius Janikowski, the FCC commissioner, who had done a study, and basically his study, suggested that the real crisis was in local and regional journalism, and I think that crisis has only deepened since we've published this report. I don't think there's any solution that anybody has for that yet, but the other stuff is still a work in progress as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, there was one great headline when this came out that said, surprise, former media executives determined it wasn't their fault. But as Martin said, that wasn't. We weren't. I was pretty sure it was our fault, but.
Well, and I would say that's an unfair criticism, and it's undermined somewhat in your interview, Martin, which we'll come back to, in which you say, yeah, there were some mistakes, but they're not in in giving away the content or some of the other things that were talked about. It was more about we should have done something really different rather than just shoveled our content on the site and called it a day.
Yeah, we should have hired hundreds of engineers and invented search-driven advertising, and
it's stuff like that. Well, let me pause here.
Why didn't we think of that?
I want to come back to at the end the point you were making about where this report's going to go from here. But I want to give some of the students an opportunity to ask some questions here. So I'm going to pick on you guys. Christopher, have you got something you'd like to ask our guests?
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Can you hear me? All right. Hello. I thought the way that you guys summarized kind of the genealogy between just the rise of the internet and like those first 4 newspapers. My question was, and I had to write it down just so I don't babble too much, but do you think there's a not catch on because the market isn't ready? So kind of like the teletext, video text era, how we weren't quite ready for that content to be delivered digitally. Is there kind of something out now that, in your opinion, since you guys have so much experience, you can kind of say, yeah, I think this won't catch now, but maybe in the future?
Martin?
Hello.
Yeah, I mean you broke up a little bit. I think I got your question, and obviously, if it's just simply applied to journalism, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure I have, an example of something that comes to mind. There's nothing out there right now that I can think of. But in technology generally, I mean, there are a whole bunch of things. I mean, one of the lessons of this is that pioneers aren't necessarily the winners. Pioneers are often losers. It's the folks who come in after the pioneers to do the kind of commercialization that makes that makes all the money. I think whether it's in personal computing or in tablets or in Knight Ridder had a tablet 20 years before Apple came out with its tablet. So you just want to be very careful about assuming that so-called first mover advantage is always leads to the win. But with respect to your question, in journalism, I can't really think of anything right now, that I think is kind of the teletext of our time. No, I think we've actually matured, matured a lot since that era, and unless you get way out there and start talking about holographic stuff and but I don't know enough about that stuff to really talk about it productively.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we're really looking for, or not me, but what people who want to perpetuate the practice of journalism are looking for is a business model that sustains real journalism. And in doing that, in that search, one thing that comes to light if you read this report carefully, or even if you just peruse it, one thing that really emerges is that the news business was always a bundled business. It was an advertising business that you bundled some sports and some news and some, you had obituaries and you had recipes. It was all this stuff bundled together to attract enough subscribers so that you could leverage advertising against them. So from a business point of view, it was always largely an advertiser-supported business with some circulation behind it. So when you look at what's going on out there today and where the journalism talent is and who they're working for, it's all over the place in terms of the new ventures. You have things like Bloomberg News, which in some ways appears to be a traditional news outlet, but it isn't really, because the company loses money on their news operation. They're not looking to make money there, they're looking to gain influence. So that's one model. Then you have models like, you know, a whole lot of other ones, like the Huffington Post doesn't generate a lot of profit, but it's of some use to AOL in the advertising, in its advertising efforts and its traffic efforts, and Politico, and you have all these new verticals, and then you get more technological, and you look at something like BuzzFeed, which is really, you know, I don't think a lot of people realize that BuzzFeed was started by an MIT graduate, and it has a who had come from AOL, and it has an algorithmic base, and it's a technology-driven platform that happens to play in the news space. So, you know, the question is, are any of these models going to emerge as the model, or are we going to go through a period where there are going to be a lot of different models, and maybe there'll always be different models? Where does Google fit into the news universe? I mean, they certainly have eaten the advertising universe. I mean, this is, in many ways, this is the story of Google's domination of the advertising business. I mean, that's really, if you had to pick one player that is the Darth Vader of the old news business, it's Google, because they just consumed the advertising business. But Twitter is certainly a great distribution platform for news. I mean, I get a lot of my news off Twitter because I find it and then I go to the original source. But I think and then you have the New York Times, which is going along with a modified, more traditional model, and I could go on and on about this. But the point is, to answer your question, no, I don't see anything out there that today you can point to and say, this is the path to the future. This is how it's all going to work out. But I can see many paths coming out of these things. And I could say that if I were somebody who was a student who was going to go out into the world and try to make a living in this field, I would be much more, or I'm not saying I would be, but I would urge anybody who is doing that to be more open-minded about the models that they attach themselves to, and more ecumenical, and not worry too much about, is this company going to be here 5 years from now? It's more like, is there a real learning curve here for me in terms of something that's going to be moving forward? Rather than maybe attaching yourself to something that is clearly entirely old world, because I don't think most of that stuff is going to survive.
Right. Thank you. Okay. How about Madeline? I'm going to pick on you. You got a question?
Sure. Yeah, sure. My name's Madeline. I'm in my last year, a journalism major. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, and see you.
Hello?
We can see you and hear you.
Hi.
Are you listening
Okay.
to us or something
Great.
else?
Well, my question.
Never mind. It was a joke. Go
my
ahead.
question would be for you, John. Like,
Yeah. Now you disappeared.
That's the Google Hangout I know and love.
Yeah, right.
You guys are breaking up. Sorry.
What was that, guys? What was that cartoon?
Hey, Madeline. Oh,
Yes.
You're breaking up. We can't get you. You want to try one more time now?
Okay. I have the volume up. Okay. I was just wondering, my question is for John. You said that as journalism students or maybe student journalists, we should attach ourselves to a model. versus a specific company or brand.
No,
Out of the three
no,
models that you mentioned, which one do you think?
no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was in evaluating your
Okay.
prospects and your opportunities, don't attach yourself to one model in your mind. I'm only going
Okay.
to work for a television network or an online startup, or I want to work here. Don't think that way. Think about, where can I do work that matters to me and learn a lot? And when I said attaching yourself to a model, I meant probably you should be very open-minded about what that model is, and probably lean toward the more forward-looking than the backward-looking, even if you don't think the forward-looking is going to last forever. In other words, take some risks.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard too to understand, you know, where we should, as journalists or aspiring journalists, we should trade or, you know, put our energy towards. Should we learn more about HTML and about web, or how to aggregate other news sources? And I think that as a student, those are the areas I think that I struggle with, and maybe some of my other peers do as well. What advice would you give?
I'm going to throw that to Dr. Nisenholtz, who is an expert on all that.
I think, look, I think there are a couple of things that, you know, John is saying, having to do with looking into yourself and understanding where you do your best work. But you know, if you talk to somebody like Ben Smith at BuzzFeed, I mean, and BuzzFeed, whether you like it or hate it, is the company with the most threaded distribution, mobile-oriented content. So using them just as a model for a minute, what Ben Smith says is, look, he doesn't necessarily care what school you came from or what, you know, what school you. What he cares about is, you know, do you have a blog? Are you writing on that blog? Are you using tools like Medium to, you know, experiment with new forms of journalism? Are you, you know, out there taking an HTML class, understanding how you know, the basics of the web work? And I think that's good advice. I think that using the tools of the web in a modern journalism context is very, very important for students. And I don't think that you know, you're going to necessarily distinguish yourself in the same ways going forward as people did in the past, where, you know, if you were editor of the Harvard Crimson, you automatically got a job at the New York Times. I mean, that just doesn't happen anymore. So in some ways, it's more about fashioning your own view of the world and your own interests inside your own publication. And I think that's good advice that Ben gave on a panel that I was on recently.
Yeah, I love that too. And I'll say, you know, when I've been to job fairs and I've talked to students, I'll tell them, I'm looking for students that have a website, you know? I'd like to see a website on your resume. I'd like to see evidence that you've used it as a little bit of a playground. You know, learned how to blog, learned how to use video, and tried that. You learned to, you know, picked up a tool like timeline.js and played with that and tried to figure out how to create a timeline using that tool. Other things like that. So I'll move on now. And how about Jacob? Do you have a question?
I do, yes. First off, thank you for taking time to talk to us. Throughout the report, obviously, there were a lot of high-level people interviewed, executives, people of that sort, and it was full of interesting information. So 2 questions. One, was anybody hesitant to, and you don't have to name names, obviously, to go on the record in the level that they did And then for each of you, what was the most interesting thing, if you can distill it down to one thing, that you all took away from the interviews and writing the report?
Well, there were two people who were. First of all, I think most of the people we interviewed, as Kurt mentioned, were very forthcoming, and there weren't any real problems there. I mean, John can comment on the Arianna Huffington interview, which I think was probably the hardest one. But the others were all very, very good. The people that refused to talk to us, I mean, I have no problem telling you who they were. Craig Newmark wouldn't talk to us for reasons that I still don't understand. Mark Andreessen refused to talk to us, again, for reasons that I don't understand. We invited several people who just simply couldn't be scheduled. Marissa Mayer had just had her baby. Sheryl Sandberg was on a book tour.
Rupert was getting divorced.
Rupert was getting divorced. So there were a bunch of people who just simply, we had 3 months, right? And we're talking about Rupert Murdoch. So, and by the way, I to this day, I think that the only truly significant hole in the report is Rupert Murdoch. I mean, he is a highly, highly instrumental guy in the history during this period of time, and the fact that we didn't get to him to me is a continuing problem with it. But all the others were very forthcoming. With respect to the one thing, I've already said that. I mean, I think the one thing that really stood out for me was the whole notion of the Riptide, that in some very significant way, not for everyone, but particularly for the local and regional newspaper companies like Tribune, like Knight Ridder, that McClatchy, which is still obviously around, so is Tribune, but in a different form. There was just nothing even the best management could do there to make it work. The best manager couldn't outrun these business problems, and that hadn't really occurred to me as clearly before we did this.
The interesting thing about Craig Newmark is that he did talk to us, but he wouldn't talk to us for the interview. He came in a room with a bunch of us and he expounded on a bunch of things.
This is the founder of Craigslist, just to make sure everybody knows.
And I don't know, it was a very unusual conversation. I didn't follow all of it. It seemed to be it was just very unusual, but he had no interest in going on the record or being part of this. I mean, one of the things that we used to convince people to do this was we said, look, we're no longer working journalists. This isn't going to be published by any major publishing company. This is Harvard University. It's for history. It's an archival project. It's an oral history. We need to get you, while you're alive and can talk, and look, it's your side of the story, enshrined forever there for historians. It's a great opportunity because we don't have an agenda, and most people took that in the spirit that we gave it, and I think that accounted for some of the candor. I don't think that we would have had the same candor had we been doing this for the New York Times or the Journal or Fortune magazine or the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They were like, okay, this is going into the vaults of Harvard, and these people are, have some experience and some credibility, so that's why they talk to us. I guess the same thing that Martin said in terms of the biggest takeaway was the inevitability. It struck me that I had once been at a speech when the first file-sharing music service, Sean Parker's
Napster.
Napster. When Napster first came out, and there were all these people from various industries there, and Bill Joy, who was one of the leading lights of Sun Microsystem at the time, told the audience, he said, okay, there's been a ruling against Napster. they got to shut it down. He said, but make no mistake about it, the horse is out of the barn, and you'll never get the horse back in the barn, and you're just going to have to deal with the digital future of music. And nobody really did that. Sony didn't do it because they had a music company, and nobody did it until Steve Jobs did it. And I guess the thing that most people that we interviewed, and certainly I didn't understand at the time, was that from the first time that you were able to take printed information and put it in a digital file that could be transported via the World Wide Web, or that all this, a huge disruption in the news business was inevitable.
All right, I'm going to ask Jillian to go ahead and ask a question. I'm going to point out that we have 10 more minutes in our time, so if I would like Jillian to get her question and answer in, and then I would like to give you guys a chance to talk about what's next for this report, which you alluded to earlier in the discussion. So Ishtiaq, I don't think we're going to get to a question from you. I apologize. Go ahead, Jillian.
Okay, I will try to go quick. My question's more about the mechanics of moving, I guess, from a typical printed newspaper to going online. Did you notice that the style of your writing had to change at all to, I guess, increase your viewership, or was it the same, just moving from a regular print to online?
I think that's a great question. I think what you find is John mentioned, Kurt mentioned the idea that I brought up in the interview about shoveling the content onto the website. And I think for the most part, over the last 20 years or so, that's exactly what newspapers have done. So they've been print first, and because that's where all the money is, and there's nothing wrong with that. This has to do with the inevitability of this problem in a way. They've taken the content that they put in the paper and just moved it over to the web and pushed it out. And along comes somebody like a BuzzFeed or like a Policy Mike or like a Business Insider, and now all of a sudden they're writing content that is written, for social media in some cases, certainly in the case of BuzzFeed, or for short-form mobile consumption in the case of Business Insider and some others. And they're getting much more traction, particularly among people under 30, than newspaper websites who are still shoveling these long-form newspaper articles onto the web. Now, I think if you look at what the Times has done with NYT Now, which is an app that it rolled out about 6 months ago, you see that finally the newsroom is beginning to assign people to write for mobile consumption. After all these years and after all this obvious, trending, finally that's happening. Okay, so that's how it's happened. So in any event, I think your question is just right. The entrepreneurs got this earlier and faster, and now I think finally the incumbents are getting it. But they're just evolving too slowly.
I spent more than half my career as a writer rather than a manager or an executive, and I was a long-form writer, and certainly I never imagined that I would have to master the art of the 140-character, story, but I kind of like doing that. It's easier than writing 10,000 words. Having said that, there are a lot of things you can say in 10,000 words that you can't say in 140 characters, and I still read the New Yorker and whatnot. But I agree with everything Martin said. I'll just add one little thing. It struck me when I was an editor somewhere in the early 2000s, it hit me that one of the big mistakes we were making on the web is we were still writing magazine headlines. And magazine headline writers were always rewarded for being clever. You'd write clever headlines that looked good with the art, and maybe they made a good cover line, and they had an irony, and they had puns, and they had historical reference and that tied in with it. It's an art. But I remember telling the people who work on these stories, putting these stories on the web. I remember I think I coined this phrase, which is certainly been around Time Inc. a long time. I don't know if anybody else ever picked up on it, but I said, guys, you don't understand. Clear is the new clever. The headline has to tell you exactly what it's about. We're living in an era of search engine optimization, and of course now, beyond that. But this headline has to let the algorithm search engines know what it's about, and it doesn't have to be interesting or entertaining or clever or ironic. It needs to say, 3-day-old fish smells bad. You'll get so yes, it's and it has. I think that the amount that it will change in the future is more than it has already changed. It's also been really bad for things like punctuation, grammar, flow, all that stuff, which I guess will eventually just die. But I'll be dead before that happens. So, and I'm glad of that.
I mean, just let me make a point that John's point about the long form and the art. I'm not a technological determinist. I don't. All new technologies naturally lead to good things. So, in my opinion, older New York Times headlines, which are, well written and very cool, are much better than listicle headlines. Okay, there's no comparison. But the thing about listicle headlines is that they're funny and people love to share them, and that's what Peretti discovered. I mean, John's point about his coming out of the Media Lab is important because at the Media Lab, what he did was research on virality. I mean, that's what his research was done there on. And so he knew coming out of the Media Lab how to create viral content. And he did that first at the Huffington Post and then created BuzzFeed out of the Huffington Post. And I think that whether you like that or not, the reality is he's got 200 million users. And he's done that by mining these headlines in a way that allows people or inspires people to share them on Facebook. And so, is that a good thing? Probably not a good thing. Probably not a good thing for society, but it's also allowed him to hire Ben Smith and a lot of other very well-known and respected reporters, and so, it's also not a terrible thing. So, I think that we'll see how it ends up, but there are two sides to the coin.
Sure. I'm going to remember clear is the new clever. I love that because Google does a lot of things very well, but Google does not understand clever.
No, they're not clever. They're rich and they're brilliant, but not clever.
Yeah. So with our last couple of minutes here, I just wanted to give you guys a chance to talk a little bit about where this report goes from here. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Martin?
Okay. I think, as I said before, John Geddes, who worked with me at the New York Times and was the #2 guy in the newsroom there, is now a fellow. Covered the Riptide. In other words, what he was intrigued by was, he asked the question, why didn't the people who covered this really kind of uncover the Riptide earlier on? In other words, what were they thinking? And I thought that was a brilliant way to take it. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but I think he's interviewing something around 10 or 12 journalists who covered this field. People, everybody from Esther Dyson to Kara Swisher, and that's the next phase of it. And we hope that somebody else comes along after that and does a phase after that. So that's the.
And at some point, enough time will have passed to where there will be a new era. Will have been, somebody someday, we hope, will be covering the era of now. But you can't cover history exactly when it's happening. So.
Right. Okay. Well, we're coming right up on the top of the hour now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up. I can't begin to tell you how many questions we didn't get to that I wanted to ask, not the least of which I wanted Martin's reaction to the New York Times Innovation Report. Maybe if you're bored on your plane ride today, you can shoot me an email with that answer. But I can't thank you both enough for taking the time to do this. I know our students thoroughly enjoyed it, and the ones that weren't here, as I mentioned, will have a recording of this, and they're going to be watching that recording. So thank you very much. Really grateful for your time. And go Cardinals.
Yeah, there's that. Thanks for your interest.
Thank you. Bye, John. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.